deep in the wilderness. I would often drive to remote forests and then hike miles into areas where almost no one ever went. No phone signal, no people passing by, just me and nature. On one trip like that, I went to a huge forest in Tennessee. The first 2 days were perfect. The weather was great, the air was calm, and I didn't run into a single person. But late in the afternoon of the second day, the sky suddenly started to darken. Thick black clouds rolled in from the west. At first, I thought it was just going to be a light rain. I had hiked in the rain many times before. But about an hour later, I realized I had seriously underestimated the storm. The wind began blowing so hard that small trees bent under the pressure. The temperature dropped quickly, and rain started pouring down in sheets. Lightning began striking very close by. At that moment, I was fairly high up on a mountainside, carrying a backpack with a metal frame. The thought of being struck by lightning suddenly made me very uneasy. I began looking around, hoping to find any place where I could take shelter. Then, through the trees, I saw something that made me breathe a sigh of relief: a small cabin. It looked extremely old, like a hunting shack that had been abandoned for years. I practically ran to it and pushed the door open. Inside it was dark and smelled damp and moldy, but at least it was dry. The room contained only a small table, a chair, and an old bed frame. I was too tired and too cold to care, so I simply sat down on the floor to rest. About 15 minutes later, once I had calmed down a bit, I started shining my flashlight around the room. That's when I noticed something strange. On the wall near the door were dozens of deep scratch marks. At first, I assumed they were just signs of age, but when I looked closer, they looked more like someone had clawed at the wall with their hands. I walked over to inspect the door, and that's when I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The door could only be locked from the outside. I turned toward the window. The glass was still intact, but all four corners of the window frame had been screwed shut from the outside. The inside of the frame was also covered with deep scratch marks, as if someone had once desperately tried to pry it open. That's when a horrifying thought crossed my mind. Maybe someone had once been trapped inside this cabin. I was about to leave when I heard a faint scratching sound against the wooden wall outside. At first, I thought it was just a branch moving in the wind, but then I heard two heavy thumps on the porch. I froze, my heart pounding. The storm was so loud that I couldn't hear clearly what was happening outside. After a few minutes, I almost convinced myself I was just imagining things, until the door suddenly jerked hard from the outside. The doorknob rattled. And that's when a terrifying thought entered my mind. If someone was outside, why weren't they coming in? The door wasn't locked, unless they wanted me to stay inside. I immediately started stuffing my things back into my backpack, preparing to leave. But at that exact moment, a loud crash of breaking glass exploded behind me. Something burning flew through the window. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted into flames. I rushed toward the door and discovered it had been jammed shut from the outside. In that moment, I understood something horrifying. Someone had just tried to burn me alive inside that cabin. When you're young, some decisions feel like nothing more than exciting adventures. But years later, when you look back, you realize you were incredibly lucky to survive. This story happened when I was in my early 20s. At the time, I had a friend named Charles. In our group of friends, Charles was known as the guy who could always find the strangest places to explore. From abandoned factories to old buildings that no one in their right mind should enter. If there was a place on the map that normal people would avoid, Charles had almost certainly already tried to get inside it. One weekend, Charles texted me with obvious excitement. He had just discovered an old wildfire lookout tower deep inside a remote forest. According to him, the tower had been abandoned for many years and almost nobody knew about it. His idea was simple. We would hike into the forest, climb the tower, and spend the night up there watching the sunrise from above. It sounded a little crazy, but at that time, I also enjoyed a bit of adventure, so we decided to do it. After nearly 3 hours of driving and several miles of hiking through the woods, we finally saw it. Rising above the trees was a metal tower roughly 20 meters tall. It looked old and unstable. Some railings were bent, and several steps were badly rusted. Just looking at it would make most people turn around immediately. but Charles looked as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. We carefully began climbing step by step. Some of the stairs shook dangerously, and the vertical ladder near the top made my palms sweat. But eventually we reached the small observation room at the very top. The view from up there was incredible. The forest stretched endlessly toward the horizon. As the sun set, the sky slowly shifted from orange to purple before fading into darkness. At first, everything was great. We sat along the walkway around the tower, drinking a few beers and talking. Until Charles did something that instantly annoyed me. He grabbed his metal water bottle and started banging it loudly against the steel railing. The noise echoed sharply through the silent forest. I immediately told him to stop. In a place that remote, making loud noises didn't seem like a smart idea. We eventually went inside the small room at the top of the tower. But while I was setting up my sleeping area, Charles suddenly called me outside in a very serious tone. He was pointing down into the forest below. At first, I couldn't tell what he was looking at. Then I saw it. A light. Far away, moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just another hiker with a flashlight. Maybe someone who had heard the metal noise earlier. But Charles didn't think so. He said the light was moving too smoothly. It wasn't swaying like a flashlight or lantern someone was carrying. We stood there watching it in silence. Minute by minute, the light got closer. Then suddenly, for a brief moment, it shot forward as if someone had fast-forwarded time, before continuing to move steadily again. About 10 minutes later, the light reached the base of the tower. And then, it stopped. We waited, expecting someone to call up, but nothing happened. Charles even shouted down, "Hello, is someone there?" No answer. The light stayed perfectly still at the base of the tower. For nearly 30 minutes, we were stuck up there, staring down at that mysterious glow. Then suddenly, it vanished. Not fading, not moving, just gone. We had barely relaxed when a few minutes later, we heard metallic noises coming from below the tower. Clanking, twisting, the sound of metal being forced. Someone, or something, was doing something to the tower. We sat there in silence for hours, too scared to move. When morning finally came, we opened the door and began climbing down. But when we reached about 3/4 of the way down the stairs, we froze. A large section of the steel staircase was completely missing. Not just a few steps, an entire section. Someone had removed it during the night, while we were sitting directly above them. The most terrifying part was, we never heard it happen. I've been camping alone in the wilderness for nearly 15 years. I understand the risks of being alone in the wild. That's why on every trip, I prepare carefully. A tent, food, water, and even a rifle just in case. But there was one trip about 2 years ago that I still can't explain. The location was a massive forest in Kentucky. It's so large that if you know the trails, you could walk for days without seeing another person. That was exactly why I chose it. At the time, my job had been extremely stressful, and I just wanted to disappear into nature for a few days. I drove to a trailhead early on a Thursday morning and began hiking into the woods. The plan was simple: 3 nights alone, deep in the forest. The first day went exactly as I hoped. I hiked a little over 10 kilometers before finding a flat area near a small creek. I set up my tent, started a fire, cooked dinner, and drank a beer while watching the flames slowly burn down. The forest around me was completely silent. There were no signs of anyone else. Around 10 p.m., I climbed into my tent and fell asleep quickly. I'm not sure what time it was, but sometime in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. Not because of a sound, just that strange instinct your brain has when you sleep somewhere unfamiliar. I lay still in my sleeping bag for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling of the tent. Then I noticed something strange. A faint orange glow was shining through the fabric of the tent. I unzipped the door and looked outside. About 200 meters away, between the trees, there was a small fire burning. Not very big, just the size of a normal campfire, but I could clearly see the flames flickering. I watched it for several minutes, trying to hear voices. Nothing. No talking, no footsteps. I assumed it was just another camper I hadn't seen during the day. People leaving a fire burning overnight isn't unusual. After watching it for a few minutes, I zipped my tent shut and went back to sleep. The next morning, the first thing I thought about was that fire. I packed up my campsite and walked toward the area where I remembered seeing the light. It only took about 10 minutes to get there, but when I arrived, I stopped. The clearing where I was certain the fire had been looked completely normal. No ring of stones, no ashes, no burnt wood, no blackened ground. The earth looked like nobody had stepped there for months. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I had simply mistaken the location. Eventually, I let it go and continued my trip. On the second day, I hiked deeper into the forest. The trees were taller here, their canopies so thick they nearly blocked out the sky. That night, I put out my fire around 9 p.m. and went to sleep. This time, I woke up because of a horrifying sound. A massive crack that lasted several seconds, like a giant tree snapping in half. Then a heavy crash shook the ground beneath my tent. I immediately knew a tree had fallen. The strange thing was, there was no wind that night. Before I could even calm down, about 10 minutes later, it happened again. Another tree. This one much closer. 2 massive trees falling in the same night, in different directions, without wind or a storm. That wasn't normal. As I tried to think of an explanation, another sound appeared. A deep, drawn-out growl. It didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard. Not a bear, not a deer, not a lynx. The sound lasted almost a full minute, like something was deliberately making noise. At that point, I was completely terrified. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around, and aimed it toward the tent door. I sat there like that for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, the sound slowly faded and then disappeared. I didn't sleep another second that night. When morning came, I packed my gear immediately and decided to leave. But before I left the area, I wanted to see the tree that had fallen closest to me. It took about 10 minutes to find it. It was enormous. But what made my blood run cold wasn't its size. It was how it had broken. The trunk hadn't snapped like it would in the wind. Instead, the wood looked torn apart with deep gouges in the bark, as if something had clawed into the tree until it collapsed. While I was looking around, I noticed something lying on the ground near one of the branches, a blue bandana and a carabiner. They looked very familiar. And yes, they were mine. Those 2 items should have been inside my backpack, which meant that, while I was sleeping, someone had opened my bag. At that moment, I didn't think about it any longer. I shoved everything into my backpack, turned around, and ran out of that forest, and I have never returned there since.